I've always been the kind of person who prefers silence over noise, solitude over crowds. That's why I started camping alone years ago. Something about being away from the constant hum of traffic, the buzz of phones, and the background chatter of people gave me peace. It was like I could actually hear myself think again. I worked a stressful desk job, one of those roles where you sit in front of a screen for 10 hours a day, mostly being asked to do things that make no real difference. My only escape was planning trips into the wild. Just me, my pack, and the open land. This time, I picked a canyon area in the southwestern part of the country. It wasn't well known or popular, exactly what I wanted. I found it while scrolling through an old hiking forum, buried in a thread from years ago. A guy posted pictures of a deep, narrow canyon surrounded by high cliffs, accessible only by foot. He said it was about an 8-mile hike in from a dirt road, and you had to descend into the canyon by following a faint path along a dry creek bed. It looked beautiful, layers of red and tan rock, no signs of humanity, and barely any information about it online. That was enough to get me interested. I left early on a Friday, sometime in late October. The forecast was clear, cool at night, dry during the day. The perfect window before winter storms began to roll through. I packed light but smart: my tent, sleeping bag, a tarp, extra water, a life straw, food for 3 days, a GPS device with offline maps, and my headlamp. I also brought a small first aid kit and my multi-tool. I'd done this enough times to know not to overpack or forget the essentials. My phone had no service even 10 miles before I reached the turnoff to the dirt road. The drive-in was long and bumpy. The road twisted and climbed through desert scrub and mesas, slowly giving way to rougher, rockier terrain. By the time I parked the car, there was no sign of anything man-made in sight. Just a single-track dirt trail leading into the hills, and beyond that, nothing but dry land and far-off cliffs. I locked the car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was rough but manageable. Loose stones, dust, the occasional cactus. I passed a few animal tracks but saw no fresh ones. As I climbed up and over a ridge, the view opened up. There it was, the canyon. It looked just like in the photos. A long, narrow gash in the earth, sheer walls stretching down maybe 100 feet. From up there, I could see the faint dry creek bed that would be my route down. The sun was already starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocks. I figured I had 2 good hours of light left. The descent took longer than I thought. The path was more of a suggestion than a trail: loose rocks, steep drops, and sharp turns. My boots slid a few times on gravel, but I stayed careful. Once I made it down, I walked along the floor of the canyon for about a half-mile until I found a spot that looked good. Flat enough for a tent, tucked against a large boulder that would block some wind. I cleared the ground, set up my tent, and laid out my tarp and gear. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. Usually, you hear at least some wind, bugs, or the distant yip of a coyote. Here, it was dead silent. No insects, no animals, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of cooling rocks. I cooked a freeze-dried meal with my small stove, ate by headlamp, and crawled into my bag early. I slept badly. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that makes you feel like something's listening. I woke up every hour, convinced I'd heard a faint crunch of gravel or a small rock being moved. But every time I stuck my head out of the tent, there was nothing. Just the canyon walls towering above me, cold and dark. By morning, I convinced myself it was just nerves. First nights out alone always messed with my head a little, especially in a new place. I got up, stretched, made some oatmeal, and packed a small day pack to explore further into the canyon. My plan was to follow the creek bed as far as I could, see what was out there, and get back by mid-afternoon. As I moved deeper into the canyon, I started noticing things that didn't feel right. At first, it was just a strange smell, something faint, sour, like old urine or rotting meat. I figured maybe a small animal had died nearby. I kept going. Then I found a shredded backpack wedged between some rocks near a bend in the canyon. It was sun-bleached and torn open. Zippers ripped, straps frayed. No name tag, no gear nearby, just the shell of the bag. I stopped and stared at it for a while. I didn't touch it. I didn't like how quiet the area was. I told myself someone probably abandoned it years ago. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder after that. A half-mile further, I found a boot. Just one. Sitting upright in the middle of the path like someone had taken it off and walked away barefoot. It looked newer than the backpack, and the laces were still tied. I started feeling something heavy in my chest, like dread was slowly pouring in and settling behind my ribs. I scanned the rocks and walls around me. Nothing moved. No sounds, no birds. Just dry heat and dead air. I turned around. I didn't want to keep going deeper. I didn't care what was further down the canyon anymore. I made it back to camp by early afternoon and tried to distract myself. Reading, eating, organizing gear. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept hearing things that didn't make sense. Small clicks, a faint scrape, always far away. Or maybe not. That second night was worse. I didn't sleep at all. I kept the headlamp on inside the tent. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside, just on the other side of the fabric. Not footsteps, not movement, just slow, controlled breathing. I held my own breath to listen, but then I realized it was just the wind passing through a crack in the rock. Or at least I hoped it was. The first light, I packed everything up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted out of that canyon. Climbing out was harder than coming down. My legs were shaking from lack of sleep, and I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. The trail wasn't obvious, and I lost it once and had to double back. Every time a rock shifted under my boot, I jumped like it was someone behind me. When I finally reached the rim, I felt relief like I hadn't in years. The sunlight felt warm again, not harsh. I took a long drink of water, scanned the landscape behind me, and started the hike back to the car. But I wasn't alone. About 2 miles from the parking area, I saw fresh tracks on the trail. Not boot prints, barefoot. Adult-sized, with toes and everything. The dirt was dry, but the prints were clear. I looked ahead and saw that they veered off into the scrub, down a slight slope. I stood there for a long time, staring. My hands were shaking. There was no reason for someone to be out here barefoot. No one camped out here. No signs, no cars, no sounds. I kept walking faster now. Every half mile, I looked over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. I started hearing things again. Stones shifting behind me, branches cracking. When I got back to the car, I threw my gear into the trunk without organizing it. I didn't even change out of my boots. I turned the key and drove, skidding on the dirt road as I got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station nearly an hour away, where my phone finally showed 1 bar of signal. I sat in the lot for almost 30 minutes, just breathing, letting the engine idle. I didn't report anything. What could I even say? I'd seen a torn backpack, a boot, heard sounds, saw tracks. That was it. I didn't know if a crime had happened, or if someone had simply gone off-grid and never came back. Maybe someone lived out there. Maybe someone watched that canyon, waiting for people like me to come through. I went back home and didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. Even now, months later, I still think about those tracks. I still think about the sound of breathing just outside my tent. That place is burned into my memory in a way no other trip ever was. I haven't gone camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. I had never been to that part of the state before. It was in a remote corner of northern Michigan, somewhere between dense forests and wide stretches of nothing. I had read about an abandoned quarry up there in some online forum where people posted about forgotten places to explore. The post mentioned that it was a granite quarry, shut down in the early 80s after several accidents. Apparently, it was left to rot ever since. Most people didn't bother going that far out. It was over 2 hours from the nearest real town. But that's exactly what drew me in. I had a long weekend ahead of me and wanted to get away from the noise. I packed everything I'd need for a 3-day solo trip. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, water filter, the usual. I also brought a hard copy map because I knew cell service would be spotty or non-existent. It was a Friday morning when I hit the road. The drive was mostly uneventful. I stopped once for gas and grabbed a sandwich before turning off the highway onto a dirt road that went on for miles. After almost an hour of following that dusty road through pine woods and fields, I reached a fork. According to the map, the quarry was about 3 miles in on the left path. The trail wasn't well kept. It looked more like a maintenance road that hadn't been driven on in years. But I kept going, bumping along slowly until I reached a flat area that seemed like an old loading zone. The map matched. I parked the car, locked it up, grabbed my gear, and started walking toward the quarry rim. The woods were thick but quiet. No wind, just the occasional bird or rustle of squirrels in the brush. After 20 minutes of hiking, I reached the edge of the quarry. It opened up suddenly, like the ground had just dropped away in a perfect square. The pit was massive, at least 300 feet across and maybe 80 feet deep. Steep rock walls ran down in layers like a giant staircase, each ledge about 10 feet high. Old rusted equipment sat along the walls and scattered across the floor below. A couple of cables hung from cranes that hadn't moved in decades. There was a path leading down one side, wide enough to have supported machinery back in the day. Now it was just overgrown and partially crumbled. I stood there for a while just staring. It was quiet in a strange way. The trees around the rim muffled the wind, and the depth of the quarry trapped the sound. It was peaceful but a little off. I decided to set up camp just beyond the rim, under a stand of tall pines. The ground was soft with needles and mostly level. From my tent, I could still see the quarry if I looked through the trees, but it gave me enough distance to feel comfortable. I pitched the tent, gathered some dry wood for a fire, and set up my little camp stove. I ate, read for a bit, and watched the sky turn a deep red as the sun dropped behind the trees. That first night, I didn't sleep well. It wasn't anything specific, just the kind of light sleep you get when you're alone in a strange place. I woke up several times. Once because I thought I heard a rock fall, but when I sat up and listened, I didn't hear anything else. I figured it could have been a squirrel or a raccoon knocking something loose. Still, something about the sound had been sharp and heavy, like a chunk of rock hitting a hard surface. Not the soft scurry of a small animal. I checked the time. It was 3:12 a.m. The next morning was cold and gray. I made coffee and walked back to the quarry rim. In daylight, the place looked even more massive. The walls were lined with streaks of color, reds, grays, even some dull greens where moss had taken hold. I spent the morning exploring the upper levels, following the paths that had once supported heavy trucks. I found old tools, broken crates, a collapsed shed with rusted fuel drums. Around noon, I decided to climb down into the quarry itself. I followed the main access path that zigzagged along the walls. It was steep in parts and loose gravel made it slow going, but I eventually made it to the bottom. Down there, it felt even more silent, like the walls trapped the air. I walked around for over an hour. The equipment was mostly wrecked. Big cranes, a conveyor belt system, even an old forklift that had been tipped over and stripped. In one corner, I found a rectangular opening in the rock face. It looked like it led into a tunnel, maybe a storage space or a drainage shaft. I shined my flashlight inside but couldn't see very far. It smelled damp, like mildew and rust. I didn't go in. That afternoon, I relaxed by the fire, read some more, and thought about exploring the tunnel the next day. That night, I again had trouble sleeping. Around 2 a.m., I heard what sounded like metal scraping against stone. It was faint but distinct. Not an animal. It came from the direction of the quarry. I lay completely still in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. I didn't move for at least 10 minutes, just listened. The sound came again, short and sharp, metal dragging against rock. Then nothing. Dead silence. The next morning, I didn't feel rested. My mind kept going back to the sound. I tried to explain it away. Maybe something fell, maybe the wind pushed something. But there was no wind that night. The trees hadn't moved. And metal doesn't scrape like that on its own. I forced myself to stick to the plan. I packed a day bag with food, water, flashlight, and a knife, and made my way down into the quarry again. The air felt colder than before. I went straight to the tunnel. The opening was about 6 feet tall, maybe 3 feet wide. It went straight back into the rock for at least 50 feet before curving out of sight. I stepped inside. My boots echoed softly on the floor, which was smooth but covered in a thin layer of grit. The walls were chiseled roughly and damp. A pipe ran along the right side, half rusted and leaking in places. I followed it deeper. The tunnel split after about 100 feet. One branch went left and seemed to slope down. The other turned sharply and stayed level. I chose the left. As I moved deeper, the air grew colder. My breath started to fog. The floor changed. Less smooth, more uneven. I passed empty storage rooms, some with broken lockers and shelves, some just bare concrete. The light from my flashlight seemed to get swallowed by the darkness ahead. I kept going. At one point, I stepped on something soft. I aimed my light down and saw an old boot, torn, moldy, and filled with dirt. That stopped me. I looked around and suddenly felt like I wasn't alone. I listened, holding my breath. Faint sounds echoed back. Tiny drips, maybe, or shuffles. Couldn't tell. My heart was pounding. I turned around and made my way back, trying to stay calm. But just before I reached the fork again, I heard something fall. A clatter of metal behind me. I froze. Then I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran the whole way out of the tunnel, up the quarry path, and didn't stop until I was back at my tent. The rest of that day, I sat near the fire, trying to process what happened. I told myself it was just something old falling on its own. Maybe the pipe finally gave way. Maybe the boot had belonged to a worker. But the tunnel had felt wrong. The silence, the cold, the sound that followed me. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed wrapped in my sleeping bag, holding my flashlight and knife. I kept the fire going and listened. At 3:27 a.m., I heard it again. This time closer. Metal scraping stone. Then a thud. Then silence. I sat up, sweating despite the cold. I stayed like that for hours. I didn't move, just waited for morning. When the sky finally turned pale, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I just broke camp and started hiking back to the car. That's when I noticed something. The trail had fresh tracks. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Deep, like someone wearing heavy boots had walked through recently. They weren't mine. They came from the direction of the quarry and followed the same path I had taken in. I checked around. No sign of anyone. No tire tracks. No broken branches. Just those prints. I hurried back to the car, heart racing. When I reached it, I checked all around. Nothing was touched. The doors were still locked. But the dust on the driver's side window had a smear across it, like someone had run their hand over the glass. I got in, started the engine, and left. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors. It's been over a year since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone since. I never reported what I found. Who would believe it? There's no law against walking through old tunnels. But I think someone, something, is still out there in that quarry. Not a ghost, not a monster. Just someone who never left. Maybe they lived there. Maybe they got trapped. Maybe they're just hiding from the world. But they weren't happy I showed up. The memory still gives me chills. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't see. Whatever was making those sounds in the tunnel didn't want to be found. And I think if I'd stayed one more night, it would have made sure I didn't leave. I didn't expect anything crazy when I decided to take a weekend off and head into the woods. I just wanted peace. I work in a small auto shop on the edge of town, and life's been busy lately. Customers yelling, cars breaking down mid-fix, parts arriving late, it just built up. I needed quiet, somewhere away from the buzz of town, even if just for a few nights. I had a spot in mind. A guy I met at a gas station a few weeks ago mentioned this remote area in the northern part of the state. He said there was an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. If I followed it far enough, he said, I'd find old clearings surrounded by thick woods, perfect for camping alone. No tourists, no campers. That sounded exactly like what I needed. I packed up Friday morning tent, sleeping bag, a couple days of food, water jugs, firewood, headlamp, flashlight, knife, GPS unit, and a power bank. I checked everything twice. I knew I'd be off-grid for a while. There wouldn't be any cell service out there, so I brought a compass and a physical map too. I even left a note with my neighbor, saying where I was going and when I'd be back. I liked being alone, but I wasn't stupid. It took nearly 5 hours to get there. First on the highway, then down a winding gravel road, and finally onto the old logging road he told me about. It was overgrown in spots, with branches scratching at the sides of my truck. The deeper I drove, the more I started to wonder if this was a mistake. But I was already there, and the quiet was exactly what I wanted. I finally stopped where the road curved sharply to the right and dipped into a small ravine. I didn't want to risk getting stuck down there, so I pulled off just before the drop. The clearing nearby was perfect. Flat ground, tall trees all around, with just enough space to set up a tent and start a fire. I set up camp slowly, enjoying the quiet. No engines, no voices, just birds and wind. The air smelled like pine and moss. The ground was damp in some spots, but dry enough to sleep on. I set up my tent facing the trees, not the road. I wanted to feel like I was alone in the woods, not parked near some old path. By sunset, the fire was going, and I had a simple meal, just canned soup and crackers. I sat by the fire until it got dark, listening to the woods settle in. At first, every snap of a twig made me look around. But as the night grew darker and cooler, I relaxed. I felt invisible, tucked away where no one could find me. That first night passed without anything strange. I slept fine. I woke once or twice to the sound of raccoons rustling near the fire pit, but nothing serious. In the morning, I heated some instant coffee and went walking along the road. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile, just enough to stretch my legs and check out the woods. The trees were thick, and the trail felt almost forgotten. Grass had grown through the gravel. There were no tire tracks, no signs anyone had been there in years. The second day was calm. I read a little, took a nap, and collected firewood. I saw deer in the distance and squirrels everywhere. The sun filtered through the trees like gold. I felt good again. I even thought about staying an extra day. But that night, something changed. It started with a sound just after midnight. I'd been asleep for a few hours when I woke up to the crunch of leaves outside my tent. It wasn't loud. Slow, careful steps. I thought it might be a deer at first, or maybe a bear. But then the footsteps stopped, right behind the tent. I didn't move. I held my breath. I waited for the sound to continue, but it didn't. Just silence. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Still nothing. I slowly unzipped the side of my sleeping bag and grabbed my flashlight. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the tent wall. No shadows, no noise, just trees. I kept listening. Then I heard it again, 2 steps, this time to the left of the tent, closer to the fire pit. Crunch, crunch. Then it stopped. I wanted to think it was an animal, but the way it moved felt different. Too heavy for a raccoon, too slow for a deer. Bears don't move that way either. I waited for 5 minutes without moving, flashlight still in hand. Then nothing. I eventually laid back down, not sleeping much after that. The footsteps never came back, and by morning, everything was quiet again. I checked the area around the tent, but I didn't find anything. No tracks, no claw marks. Nothing was touched. I told myself it had to be an animal and tried to shake it off. That third day felt different though. The quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt like something was watching. I went for another short hike to clear my head, but turned around sooner than planned. I kept feeling like I was being followed. I didn't see anything, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Around late afternoon, I found something that made my stomach twist. I was looking for kindling and wandered a bit into the trees behind my tent. Maybe 100 feet in, I found a tree with something carved into it. It was old, but the marks were still clear. A square with an X through it. Underneath that, a line of numbers, hard to read, but I made out 061219. It didn't look like something a hiker would carve for fun. The symbol didn't mean anything to me. I took a photo with my camera and backed away. Something about it made my skin crawl. Back at camp, I sat by the fire and thought about leaving early. I knew it would get dark soon, and driving out in the dark on that overgrown road didn't sound smart. I decided to sleep one more night, wake early, and head out at first light. But that night was worse than the last. It started the same, footsteps in the dark. But this time I was ready. I kept the flashlight in my hand and didn't move. The steps were slower, closer. I heard them circle the tent once, then stop right in front of the entrance. I didn't dare breathe. Then I heard a click. It sounded like metal, not loud, but sharp, like a pocket knife opening. My body went cold. I wanted to jump out and yell, to do something, but I froze. Then the sound stopped. The footsteps backed away, slow and steady. Then nothing. I laid there, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers cramped. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I got out of the tent. Everything looked normal. Nothing was missing, nothing broken. I packed up fast, skipping breakfast. I loaded the truck and got the hell out of there. The drive back down that logging road felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees made me flinch. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone running after me. When I got back to pavement, I finally exhaled. I drove straight home, didn't stop once. When I got there, I locked every door and window, then sat on my couch and didn't move for hours. The next day, I checked the photo of the carving. I tried searching for the symbol and the numbers. I found nothing. The square with an X through it didn't seem to match anything online. The numbers looked like a date, maybe June 12, 2019, but that didn't help. I didn't go back to work for 2 days. I told them I was sick. I still think about what happened out there. I think someone else knew about that spot. Someone who wasn't just passing through. Someone who'd been there before and maybe didn't like finding someone else camping there. Maybe they weren't expecting me. Maybe they wanted to scare me off. Or maybe they were deciding what to do with me. I don't camp alone anymore. I haven't left the city since that trip. And that carving? I still have the photo, but I wish I didn't. I never found out who or what was walking around my tent that night. But whatever it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. And I don't think it was just a coincidence that the footsteps stopped right in front of the tent. Right before I heard the click. I got out before anything happened. Barely. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. But I know this, some places are better left alone. And next time someone tells me about a hidden spot deep in the woods, I'll smile, nod, and never go near it. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. After too many weekends stuck behind screens and city noise, I needed to clear my head. I wanted something quiet, far from anyone, far from cars, and especially far from cell signals and responsibilities. So I picked a part of national forest land that barely anyone visited. It was marked as a backcountry zone. No campgrounds, no fire pits, no toilets. Just open space, dense forest, and long ridgelines that looked promising on the map. I packed up my gear the night before, set my GPS points manually into a topographic map app, printed a backup just in case, and drove out at dawn the next morning. The trailhead wasn't even marked. I had to park in a small turnout off an old Forest Service road and hike down an abandoned logging path for the first few miles. It was already hot by mid-morning, and I could hear insects buzzing before I even stepped into the tree line. The forest was dense but beautiful. Deep pine, fir, and thick undergrowth. The kind of place where you don't hear cars, just wind pushing through the branches and the occasional crack of something stepping on dead wood. I hiked for most of the day, gaining elevation slowly as I followed a rough trail that looped around the side of the ridge. It wasn't maintained anymore, just faint boot tracks here and there, occasionally marked with an old pink ribbon tied to a branch. By afternoon, my shirt was soaked with sweat, my legs ached, and I was running low on water. I filled up from a cold stream I'd marked on my map and filtered it carefully. Then I kept going, figuring I'd set up camp a few miles further at a saddle between two hills. That was the plan anyway. I was a few hours past that stream when I saw something odd. The forest on this side of the ridge had a different feel. Less undergrowth. Trees spaced wider apart. The trail kind of disappeared for a while, and I had to bushwhack, relying more on compass bearings than visible markings. I was checking my GPS when I saw something off to my left, maybe 30 yards away through the trees. It looked like a tarp, just a flash of blue between the tree trunks. I stopped and looked harder. It was hard to tell. Could have been a piece of trash. But it wasn't just that. There was something unnatural about the shape behind it, like squared-off corners where the tarp was draped over something rigid. I figured maybe someone had built a hunter's blind out here, or maybe another backpacker had set up an early camp. I didn't call out. I never do that out here, just in case it's someone who doesn't want company. Instead, I stood still for a while, watching, listening, but I didn't see or hear anything. Just bugs, wind, and the normal creaks of an old forest. Curiosity got the better of me. I left the trail, if you could even call it that, and moved toward the blue shape. I walked slowly, stepping carefully to avoid snapping branches or tripping. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tarp over a tent. It was a tarp over a wooden structure. Not a cabin, more like a large wooden box. There were two of them, actually, built low to the ground, covered in camouflage netting under the tarp. Fresh wood, not something old and rotted. There was no one around. That's when I noticed the smell. Faint at first, like earth and chemicals, but stronger the closer I got. A sharp, acrid smell. Not quite gas, not quite rot. It reminded me of fertilizer. I was standing there trying to figure out what I was looking at when I saw more signs. A narrow trail, recently cleared, heading downhill from the structures. It had fresh boot prints. And next to it, I saw two large plastic water tanks, half buried in the ground. That's when it clicked. This wasn't a campsite. This was a grow site, hidden, illegal, and probably still active. My stomach dropped. I'd heard stories, people stumbling into grow ops deep in the forest, usually on public land. Sometimes abandoned, sometimes not. And if someone was around, they weren't the type of people who wanted hikers poking around. Best case scenario, I leave without being seen. Worst case, I run into someone who sees me as a threat. I backed away slowly, trying not to disturb anything. I hadn't touched anything, hadn't even taken a picture. My heart was pounding. I turned and started back toward where I thought the trail had been, but the trees all looked the same now. I felt the first real spike of panic when I realized I didn't recognize anything. I pulled out my GPS and checked my coordinates. Still within a mile of the trail, but my signal kept bouncing, maybe from the canopy. I walked uphill to get my bearings and finally found a spot where I could see a bit of the sky. I reoriented and started moving again, quick but careful, staying quiet, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Took me nearly an hour to get back to the faint trail. I didn't stop. I didn't even rest. I kept hiking uphill, deciding I'd camp way further out. I just wanted to put distance between me and that setup. That night, I made camp on a slope overlooking the valley below. No fire. I didn't cook. I just ate a protein bar, drank filtered water, and climbed into my sleeping bag before the sun even fully set. Couldn't sleep. Every noise made me flinch. I kept thinking someone had seen me, that someone was following me. But nothing happened that night. The next morning, I packed fast. I left no trace, checked my surroundings twice, and set off early. I changed my plan. I was gonna hike all the way out, no second night. It would be a long day, but I didn't want to risk running into anything else. The hike back started fine. The sun was bright through the trees, the trail easier to follow on the return. I made good time in the morning, crossed the stream again by midday, and figured I had maybe 6 miles to go. That's when I saw something ahead of me on the trail. Boot prints. Fresh ones. They hadn't been there on my hike in. And they weren't mine. I wear trail runners with a distinct pattern. These were deep, wider, and looked like they came from heavy boots. Maybe 2 sets of them. They were coming toward me on the trail. I froze again. I scanned the woods but didn't see anyone. No sounds except the birds. I checked my GPS and map again. Still the same trail. Only one real way out of this section. I kept walking. Slower now. More cautious. My eyes scanned the brush constantly. I was maybe 2 miles from the old road when I heard it. A sound behind me. A stick cracking. Then nothing. I didn't look back. I just walked faster. 15 minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer. I stopped, turned around slowly. I didn't see anyone, but the forest felt off, too quiet now, like the birds had stopped. I waited. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. Still nothing, so I kept going. I moved fast now, practically speed hiking, checking behind me every few minutes. At one point, I left the trail and cut a loop uphill, hoping to confuse anyone following me. I waited up there, hidden behind some rocks, for almost 20 minutes, watching the trail from above. That's when I saw him, a man, maybe in his 40s or 50s, wearing a dark green jacket and a large pack. He walked slowly, looking side to side like he was searching for something. He wasn't hiking fast. He was scanning. I stayed completely still. He passed below me, maybe 30 feet away, never looked up. After he was gone, I stayed put for another 10 minutes. Then I cut back down and ran. I didn't stop again until I reached my car. The trailhead was still empty. My car was untouched. I got inside, locked the doors, and drove until I hit pavement. Even then, I kept checking my mirror for a while. I didn't report it. I should have, probably. But I didn't have pictures, didn't have coordinates, and honestly, I didn't want my name tied to it. I didn't want someone finding out I'd been there. Maybe that was paranoid. But something about the way that man moved, the way he looked at the trees like he expected someone to be watching, it still gives me chills. I haven't gone back since. And I won't. I still hike, still camp sometimes. But I don't go that far out alone anymore. I stick to marked trails, places with people. Not because I'm afraid of the wilderness. It's not the animals or the terrain that gets you. It's what people do when they think no one's watching. I had been planning the trip for a few months. Nothing crazy, just a solo weekend out in the woods. I wanted a break from my phone, from work, from the constant noise of the city. I wasn't new to hiking or camping. I had all the right gear. I was used to long hikes and camping alone. I even liked being out there with just myself and nature. I had picked a spot in the mountains a few hours from home. I found a national forest that was less popular than the others. It had a few marked trails, a lake I could filter water from, and a ridge that supposedly gave a great view of the valley. That ridge was what I was going for. I had found a few mentions of it on old hiking forums, but it wasn't marked on the official maps. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, knife, map, compass, GPS, enough food for 4 days, 2 water bottles, and a filter. I carried a flashlight, a headlamp, and backup batteries. My phone was charged and I had a portable solar charger. I wasn't planning to use it much, but it was there in case of emergency. I left early Friday morning, reached the trailhead by around 10 a.m., and locked my car behind the small ranger gate. There were only 2 other cars in the lot. The trail started out wide and clear. The trees weren't too dense, and the path was easy to follow. The air smelled fresh, like pine and dirt, and it was quiet except for birds and the wind through the leaves. It felt good to be away from everything. By the afternoon, I was deep into the forest. I had followed the main trail for a while, then branched off to an unmarked path I'd seen on a GPS app. It was faint but there, probably used by hunters or more experienced hikers. According to my plan, I'd follow this for another mile or so, then bushwhack my way up to the ridge. I camped near the top, get some great views, and then head back the same way I came. The first day was fine. I reached a small flat area near a creek just before sunset and decided to set up camp there. It wasn't too high up yet, but I figured I'd tackle the ridge in the morning when I was fresh. I set up the tent, filtered some water, ate one of the dehydrated meals I brought, and just sat outside for a while listening to the night sounds. It got cold quickly once the sun dropped. I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. The forest was quiet, too quiet. There weren't many bugs, no frogs, barely any animal sounds, just wind. I'd camped in plenty of places where nights were silent, so I didn't think too much of it. The next morning, I ate a quick breakfast, packed up, and started heading toward the ridge. It was steeper than I expected. The trees were thicker, and I had to use both hands to push through at times. I kept checking the GPS and compass, making sure I was going the right way. I wasn't on any kind of trail anymore. I was making my own path, but everything lined up with my plan. By midday, I found what I thought was the ridge. It sloped up, leveled out a bit, and then continued up in a steep line. It looked right. The GPS didn't show a lot of detail up here, but the elevation change matched what I had read. I climbed up and found a small clearing. It wasn't the top, but I could see through the trees, and it was beautiful. Layers of forest and hills stretched out in all directions. I decided to keep going. I wanted to get as close to the summit as possible. The higher I climbed, the stranger it got. The trees started to thin out, but not in the way they usually do at higher elevations. They looked damaged, like they'd been hit by lightning or disease. Some had black streaks running down the bark. Others were missing patches of leaves or had limbs twisted in weird ways. I didn't like it, but I told myself it was just nature being unpredictable. Then I found something I didn't expect. A narrow animal trail leading along the side of the ridge. It looked fresh, like it had been used recently. I followed it, thinking maybe it would make things easier. It wound around the side of the ridge for a while, then dropped slightly into a small valley I hadn't noticed. I looked at the GPS again. The ridge wasn't supposed to dip here, but sometimes the satellite images were off. I figured I'd keep going and loop back up the other side. I descended into the valley and immediately felt a shift in the air. It was cooler, damper. The ground was softer, almost spongy. There was moss everywhere, thick and dark green, covering rocks and tree trunks like a blanket. Felt like no one had been down here in a long time. There were no footprints, no broken branches, just the trail carved into the moss. I kept going, but I felt uneasy. I checked the compass again, and it was spinning slowly in my hand. Not violently, not all over the place, just slowly turning, like something was messing with it. I tapped it, shook it a little, but it didn't stop. I checked the GPS and the signal was weak. It said I was still on the ridge, but I clearly wasn't. The topography was all wrong. There should have been a sharp climb after the clearing. Instead, I was in a basin with no clear slope up or down. I stopped and looked around. The moss, the trees, the stillness. It all felt off. I tried to backtrack, but I couldn't find the trail I came in on. The moss had bounced back, hiding the marks I left behind. I walked in circles for a bit, trying to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. I marked a tree with my knife and walked in one direction for 10 minutes. No change. I was still in the mossy valley, still surrounded by those warped trees. Panic crept in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I pulled out the map and tried to reorient myself. Even if I was off course, I knew the general direction of the trail. If I kept going west, I should eventually hit the path I came in on. I packed everything up and started hiking west, using the sun as a guide. But west kept leading me deeper into the valley. The moss got thicker, and the ground got wetter. My boots started sinking in. I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water or at least downhill to a road or trail. That's when I found the bones. They weren't old, still white, still with bits of flesh clinging to them. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer or a bear. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. The bones were scattered, not like an animal had been dragged and eaten, but like something had just dropped them there. Clean slices through some of them. One had a clear cut straight through the middle like it had been sawed. I didn't stay long. I picked up the pace, still heading downstream. It was getting late, and I needed to set up camp. I found a small dry patch between some trees and forced myself to stop. I set up the tent quickly, ate a protein bar, and tried to sleep. But every sound outside felt sharp and close. I kept hearing things. Twigs snapping, water sloshing, low thuds like something heavy stepping on wet ground. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I packed up fast and started moving again. The stream had grown into a small creek. I followed it for hours. No signs of people, no tracks, nothing. I was starting to wonder if I had wandered into some uncharted part of the forest that wasn't supposed to be accessible. The trees here were taller, older. Some had trunks so wide I couldn't wrap my arms around them. I was exhausted, hungry, and sore. My feet were soaked. I sat down to rest and realized I hadn't seen the sun all day. The sky was gray, thick with low clouds. Felt like evening, but it was only noon. I checked the GPS again, no signal. Compass still spinning. That's when I smelled smoke. It was faint, but it was there with smoke like from a fire. I stood up and turned slowly, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I walked toward it, heart racing. If someone had a fire, it meant I wasn't alone out here. Maybe help, maybe a campsite. I followed the smell for 20 minutes, then 30. The smoke smell got stronger, but still no fire. No people, no ashes or signs of burning. Then I started to worry that maybe the forest itself was smoldering. I looked up, expecting to see smoke rising through the trees, but there was nothing, just the smell. I turned around and tried to go back the way I came, but the forest had shifted again. The trees weren't where I remembered. The moss was even thicker. I found one of my boot prints from earlier, but it was facing the wrong way, like I had looped without realizing it. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just wrapped myself in the sleeping bag and curled up between two roots. I didn't eat. I didn't move. I just lay there listening to the forest breathe around me. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to birdsong. It was the first normal sound I'd heard in days. I got up, legs aching, and started moving toward the sun again. The creek was gone. I was surrounded by thick underbrush. I kept going for hours. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled onto a dirt path. Not a trail, more like a logging road. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was clear enough to follow. I walked that road until night fell, then walked some more. Around midnight, I saw the first sign of people. An old hunting shack with a rusted tin roof. I took a week off work to clear my head. Things had been piling up. Deadlines, meetings, noise, emails that never ended. I felt like I hadn't had a real breath in months. I didn't want beaches or hotels or busy campgrounds. I wanted silence, still air, trees, dirt under my nails, and water cold enough to sting my skin. So I chose a remote section of national forest I'd never been to before, Stone Ridge Forest, somewhere in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. I had no real plan except to follow a trail for a few days, set up camp beside a creek, maybe fish a little, then hike back out. The forest was deep, the kind that swallows sound. I started on a narrow trail that twisted up into thick pine woods. I had my pack on, about 40 pounds. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 6 days, water filter, basic gear. My boots were solid and already broken in. My phone had no signal about a mile in, which was fine. I wasn't trying to be reachable. The trail climbed gradually, following an old logging road before turning into a narrow, overgrown path. I kept hiking for hours, stopping only to drink water or eat a quick snack. I passed no one. I saw no signs of campsites. The deeper I went, the more it felt like no one had been out there in years. Around late afternoon, I reached a point where the trail dipped down into a shallow valley. A small creek flowed there, shallow and fast, winding between mossy rocks and fallen logs. The spot felt right. Trees arched over the water, and there was a flat patch of dirt just off the creek bank. I dropped my pack and stretched. I set up my tent a few yards from the water and boiled some water for freeze-dried chili. As the sun dropped, the air turned cool. The wind barely moved. No sound except the water and the occasional bird call far off. I sat by the creek for a while, watching the way the light hit the trees. That first night, I slept like a stone. The next morning, I woke up early, drank coffee from my tin mug, and watched the creek. I felt better than I had in a long time. Clean, grounded. I spent most of the day exploring the area. No real destination. I followed the creek upstream, hopping rocks, pushing through brush, and climbing over fallen trees. I saw a few deer prints in the mud and some small fish darting through pools. By afternoon, I circled back and cooked another quick dinner. It was quiet again that night, and I fell asleep quickly. On the third day, things started to feel different. That morning, I found something strange near the water. An old, rusted tin can wedged between two rocks. It looked like a food can, maybe beans or something, but it had no label and was caked in rust. I'd seen litter before on trails, but this felt off. The can had holes in it like it had been shot, and the edges were crimped like it had been pried open with a knife. I picked it up with a stick and tossed it into my garbage bag, figuring I'd haul it out later. Later that afternoon, while hiking a narrow game trail about a mile from camp, I saw more signs. A tarp half buried under leaves, sun-bleached and torn, and a pile of old, cracked glass bottles nearby. The bottles looked like they'd been there for years. Most were broken. I saw no sign of a fire pit or tent poles, just the bottles and the tarp. I got a weird feeling standing there, like I'd walked into someone's forgotten place. I didn't linger. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The air felt heavier. I kept waking up, listening. At one point, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard something out by the creek. Not just the water, but movement. Footsteps? It was hard to tell. Could have been a deer or a raccoon. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding. Eventually, I fell asleep again, but I kept dreaming about someone standing outside my tent, breathing. The next morning, I checked around the camp. No tracks, no sign of anything out of place, except that my trash bag had been dragged about 10 feet and ripped open. The old can was gone. I found the remains of some wrappers scattered through the brush. That felt strange. I always tie my trash bag high in a tree, not bear-proof, but enough to keep raccoons out. Something had cut the rope. Not chewed, cut. I stayed close to camp that day. I didn't like the idea of someone else being out there with me, especially if they were sneaking around at night. I hadn't seen any signs of other people on the trail in or out. No footprints, no tents. That afternoon I walked the creek downstream for a while and saw something even worse. About half a mile down, tucked behind a thick clump of trees and blackberry bushes, I found a structure. Not a cabin, not even a shed, but a shack made from logs and tarp. It looked abandoned, maybe half collapsed. The roof had caved in on one side, and the tarp flapped in the breeze. I crept closer and peeked inside. The floor was dirt, scattered with leaves and bits of junk. A broken camp stove, empty cans, animal bones. The bones looked like deer or rabbits, mostly clean. There were plastic jugs lined up against one wall, and in the corner was a pile of clothing, moldy, damp, ripped up. I saw boots, torn jeans, what looked like an old sleeping bag. Something in the air smelled sharp, like ammonia and rot. I backed out slowly. Back at my camp, I packed my things. I wanted to get out before dark. The map showed a different trail about 2 miles north that looped around and connected to the main route. I figured I could make it back to my car by the next afternoon if I moved fast. I stuffed everything into my pack, double-checked my gear, and filled my water bottles. Just before leaving, I noticed something else. Near the edge of my camp, where the ground sloped down toward the creek, I saw footprints. Not mine, bare feet, human. The prints were wide and dirty, toes splayed. They came from the direction of the trees and circled the camp, then disappeared into the brush. My stomach dropped. I hadn't heard anything the night before, and I hadn't seen anyone. But someone had been here, close. I left fast. I didn't run, but I moved steady, keeping my head on a swivel. The new trail was harder to follow, barely visible in spots, but I kept my compass out and followed the direction I needed. The trees got denser and the terrain rougher. I felt like I was being watched. I didn't stop to eat, just kept walking until my legs were shaking. By early evening, I found a small clearing near a slope and set up a fast, cold camp. No fire, just my tent behind some brush. I barely ate. I kept the knife I always carry close to my sleeping bag. I stayed awake for a long time, listening. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no insects, just the occasional creak of trees in the wind. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard breathing. Not mine, not close, but close enough. It was slow and wet, like someone breathing through their nose just beyond the edge of the trees. I stayed still. My hands were clammy, I couldn't see anything through the tent walls, but I didn't dare unzip it. The breathing stopped after a while. I waited an hour before I moved. At first light, I packed everything again and left. My legs were stiff, my mouth dry. I was exhausted, but the adrenaline kept me going. I followed the trail north again, checking the map every 10 minutes. Finally, by late afternoon, I saw a marker, an old wooden sign pointing toward the main trailhead. I was still 5 miles out, but I nearly cried when I saw it. That last stretch was brutal. My feet were blistered, and I kept stumbling on roots. Every sound made me jump. I felt like someone was behind me the whole way. I didn't stop once, not even to drink water. When I finally saw my car at the trailhead, parked in a patch of gravel beside the forest gate, I dropped my pack and leaned against it, heart hammering. I didn't even take my boots off. I drove straight out, dust rising behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the nearest gas station an hour away. I bought water, jerky, and sat in the bathroom for 15 minutes just to breathe. It's been months since that trip. I still don't know what I walked into out there. I've searched online for missing persons, for stories about that forest, but found nothing solid. Just rumors, people going off-grid, old survivalist camps, things like that. Maybe it was someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe they were harmless, but it didn't feel harmless. I still go camping, but never that deep, never alone. I keep my trips short now. I stay where there's cell signal near other people. I don't follow strange trails. I don't ignore gut feelings, and I'll never go back to Stone Ridge. I had been hiking and camping for years, mostly in the Midwest and some parts of the Rockies. I liked being alone in the woods. No phone, no emails, no noise. Just trees, air, water, and the crunch of dirt under my boots. That was what kept me going when life got too loud. I worked in a small warehouse and didn't have many friends, and that was fine. I liked the quiet. It was early fall when I decided to head out to the Ridge Trail area in western Colorado. I had never been there before, but I had read online that it was more remote than the popular trails. Less traffic, more solitude, and harder terrain. That sounded perfect to me. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, GPS, topo map, first aid, some trail food, and my usual camp gear. I gave my brother a rough idea of where I'd be, like I always did, just in case. I planned for 5 days out. The drive up was uneventful. Some winding mountain roads, patches of gravel, steep inclines. I parked in a pull-off spot near the trailhead that wasn't marked by any big signs, just a small wooden post with Ridge Trail carved into it. It felt remote already, even before I stepped onto the dirt path. No cars in sight, no voices, no movement but the wind in the dry pine branches. The first day of hiking went smooth. The air was crisp, and the leaves had just started to turn. It wasn't too steep at first, and I made good time. Around mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing a few hundred yards off the trail that looked like it had been used before. Flat ground, old fire ring, and a few logs someone had dragged over to sit on. I set up my tent, boiled some water, ate a few packets of trail mix and jerky, and settled in for the night. The stars came out bright. No clouds, no noise, just the way I liked it. The second day, I decided to take a spur trail that looped off the main one. It wasn't on the standard maps, but I had seen it mentioned on a hiker's forum. Apparently, it led to a small ridge with a great view of the valley. The trail was narrow and a bit overgrown, but I followed it for about 4 hours. I reached the ridge around noon. It was worth it. The land dropped off into a massive open basin, ringed by tree-covered slopes. No buildings, no roads, just nature. After eating lunch and filling my water bottle from a nearby stream, I started heading back down toward the main trail. That's when I saw it. Off to the right, maybe 50 yards off trail, something looked out of place. Not an animal, not a hiker, something man-made. I stepped off the trail, crunching through dry underbrush, and came closer. It was an old canvas tent, mostly collapsed, hidden under some low branches. The color had faded to a dull brown, and it blended in with the dirt and leaves. first, I thought maybe someone had abandoned it long ago. But the closer I got, the more it didn't feel right. There was gear outside the tent. A rusted stove. A boot, just one. Torn fabric. Trash scattered in a small radius. I circled slowly, not touching anything. Something about it felt too recent. The items weren't weather-worn enough to have been out here for years. Maybe a few months at most. The boot didn't look moldy or shredded. A pot still had what looked like old food burned into the bottom. There were broken branches all around, like something big had moved through the area fast. Not just fallen from wind. I looked closer and saw deep grooves in the ground, like someone had dragged something heavy. I stepped back, heart starting to beat faster. It didn't feel like an old forgotten camp. It felt like someone had left in a hurry, or had been forced to. I looked around. No signs of a body, no blood, but that didn't comfort me. I checked the trees for any sort of marker or gear, but nothing else stood out. I pulled out my phone to mark the GPS location, but there was no service. Not surprising. I didn't like the idea of being near it, but I took a few pictures just in case. Then I got back on the spur trail and made my way to the main path. I decided to move on and find a new spot to camp for the night, farther away. I hiked another few miles until sunset, just to put distance between me and that tent. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside my tent made my muscles tense. Crickets, branches creaking, wind, normal stuff, but I couldn't settle. My mind kept going back to that old campsite. Who had been there? Where had they gone? Why had they left everything behind? By morning, I felt groggy but determined to finish the loop and head back. I had planned for 5 days, but I didn't feel like staying that long anymore. I packed up and kept moving. The trail climbed higher and crossed rocky terrain that gave me views over the tree canopy. Beautiful, sure, but I felt exposed. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening harder than usual. I didn't see anyone. Not all day. That night, my campsite was halfway up a ridge near a rock outcropping. I chose it because it gave me a view downhill and I could see anyone approaching. I set up, ate a cold meal, and didn't build a fire. I wanted to stay hidden. Sometime after midnight, I woke up, not to a sound, but to a feeling, like something had changed. The air was still, too still. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. My eyes adjusted. The trees were still. No movement, but something was off. I listened. Then I saw it on the trail below the ridge, maybe 100 yards down. A flicker of movement. Then another person. I ducked back inside the tent and turned off my headlamp. My heart was racing. I waited, counting the seconds. Peeked again. The figure was still there, but barely visible now. They weren't carrying a light, just moving slow, looking around, alone. I stayed low until they passed out of sight. I waited another hour before trying to sleep again. The next morning, I packed up before the sun rose. I didn't eat, just drank some water and started walking. I had 2 more days to the trailhead, but I figured I could push through and make it back in one if I hustled. By late morning, I reached a section of trail that narrowed between steep rock faces. I turned a corner and stopped dead. Footprints. Fresh ones. Not mine. Bigger. Heavy tread. Maybe boots. They were coming from the direction I had just come from and veered off into the trees. I kept walking. Midday, I stopped at a stream to refill water. I knelt down and saw something upstream. Clothes. A shirt, hanging from a branch like it had been washed and left to dry. But it was stained. Brown-red. Maybe mud. Maybe not. I didn't check. I filtered the water fast and kept moving. About an hour later, I passed another makeshift campsite. No tent, just a lean-to made from branches and a tarp. Newer than the other one I'd seen. There were wrappers, footprints, a plastic jug of water. Someone had been staying here, maybe recently, maybe still around. I didn't stop. I walked faster. My legs were getting sore, but I didn't care. The forest felt like it was closing in now. Every shadow looked like movement. Every crack of a twig made my stomach twist. At one point, I saw something in the distance, movement on the trail behind me. I didn't stop to check who it was. Around 4 p.m., I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't marked. I didn't remember it from the way in. One path looked more used. The other was overgrown but headed in the right direction based on my compass. I chose the overgrown one, less likely to run into whoever might have been behind me. That turned out to be a mistake. About a mile in, the trail vanished into dense brush. I pushed through it for another hour before realizing it wasn't a trail at all, just an animal path. I had gone off course. My GPS had 1 bar of battery left. I checked my location. It showed I was northeast of the main trail, maybe 2 miles off. I backtracked, but the sun was dropping and the woods were getting darker by the minute. I had to set up camp. I found a dip between 2 hills and set up my tent in the lowest spot I could find, trying to stay out of view. I didn't cook. I didn't use light. I just sat inside, knees pulled up, listening. That night I heard footsteps, not animals. Slow, steady steps on dry leaves, then stopping. Starting again. They circled my area once, then faded. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loud. I waited until the sun rose before I packed and moved again. The last day was the worst. I was tired, hungry, sore, but I didn't stop. I got back to the main trail just before noon and pushed through mile after mile without looking back. I felt like something was behind me the whole time, just out of sight. At one point, I dropped my water bottle and didn't even go back for it. By late afternoon, I saw the wooden post that marked the trailhead. I almost didn't believe it. My car was there, untouched. I climbed in, locked the doors, and sat for a long time, breathing, shaking, trying to process everything. I drove straight home, didn't stop for food, didn't stop for gas. I made it in one stretch, and when I got there, I called my brother and told him I was back. I didn't mention the tent, or the campsite, or the footsteps. I uploaded the GPS photos and marked the coordinates